Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the delay. There's been technical difficulties now, but we're good now. My name is Waffa. I'll be your moderator for today. I'm a research assistant here in CSIS Indonesia. We're glad to have you. Thank you for joining us. I see in attendance some excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues. I think we got colleagues from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Australia. I think I've seen somewhere Ambassador McCarty, former Ambassador McCarty is joining us. Thank you very much. Also colleagues from the National Resilience Institute, Lemhanas, as well from the Indonesian National Armed Forces headquarters. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us. This is a very important event. And for introducing the event, to open the event, I'd like to give a few time to Dr. Phillips Formonte to open us with a few words. Dr. Phillips Formonte, are you live?
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Waffa, and thank you, everyone, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this morning for this webinar. This is a launch of the report that was done by the three institutions, CSIS Indonesia, Lowy Institute in Australia, and Observer Research Foundation in India. And I would like to particularly thank Evan Laksmana, a senior researcher at the Department of International Relations at CSIS, for initiating this, the writing of the report, together with Ben Bland, our longtime friends. Thank you, Ben, and Premesha Saha of the OIRF in New Delhi. I hope that today's webinar will be of help for us to understand the development of the Indo-Pacific as a evolving conceptual framework for strategic cooperation and collaboration. I think this is even more relevant, and I think the discussion will be helpful for us to understand how then we react and respond to the new development. As we know, we are in the pandemic situation, and at the same time, geopolitical rivalry continues, and so many on our plate. And then this one particular report probably address one of those strategic problems that we are facing today. So I hope we are going to have a very good discussion. Over to you, Waffa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips Formonte, for giving us the opening remarks. Now we'll continue on to the main session. As Dr. Phillips has said, we're introducing, launching the report. You can see here the report titled, as well as the webinar's title, Anchoring the Indo-Pacific, the Case for Deeper Australia-India-Indonesia Trilateral Cooperation. 3 countries that, as the report suggests, anchors the region. All 3 have suggested their own vision for Indo-Pacific. Indonesia is the, one of the major driving force behind the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. Australia has been for years using the term Indo-Pacific in their foreign policy white papers. India, of course, under Prime Minister Modi, have the Act East policy. And I think one sentence that suggests the importance of this trilateral that I find in this report is that if these 3 countries is going to make some meanings of the term Indo-Pacific, they will have to really consider this 3-way permutation between Indonesia, India, and Australia. Now, I'd like to introduce to you the sources of today's webinar. The 3 writers of the report are here. First off, we've got Dr. Evan Laksmana, our own senior researcher and political scientist here in CSIS Indonesia. Next, we've got Dr. Premesha Saha, the associate fellow from the Strategic Studies program at the Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi, India. And last but not least, we got Benjamin Bland, the director of the Southeast Asia program at the Lowy Institute for International Policy, Australia. Now, the format of the event will run for approximately the next 1 hour. And then after that, we'll have, of course, the Q&A session. For those of you who have questions, you can input them in the panel on your Zoom application, in the bar, on Q&A bar, if you can see them right below. For those of you tuning in from YouTube, you can also input your questions from the chat box, and the team will transfer them to me, and I'll read them to you for you. Now, for the first speaker that we have today, I think I can ask Dr. Ivan Laksmana to introduce us, first of all, of course, to the report now, that to the content of the report, as well as since this has been this was a product of last year, also a bit of an update from the Indonesian perspective now that we have COVID-19 and the pandemic, what sort of changes and updates that we can have to the report. I think we can have the floor. We can give it to you first, Dr. Ivan.
Thank you, Waffa, for that kind introduction. First, let me say good morning and welcome to all of our distinguished panelists and audience. Before we begin, let me say also thank to DFAT Australia for providing the support for the report over the past year. So today I'll just speak very briefly about 3 key points, kind of the premises and the underlying key arguments of the report, what the report was about, because this was written in the pre-COVID era, and then I'll try to talk a little bit about some of the potential updates to the report, given what's been happening in the last few months. The report was created and was drafted with the premise that as the 3 key anchors of the Indo-Pacific, the notion that we can only just rely on multilateralism and bilateralism alone is not sufficient. So we have to figure out a way in which these 3 countries, as the key strategic anchors of the Indo-Pacific, can work together in a new minilateral framework. When we crafted the report, not only do we feel that the state of bilateral relationship between India and Australia, Australia and Indonesia and India are uneven, which makes a long-term sustainable trilateral framework pretty difficult. We also found that when it comes to the key opinion makers and the policy makers in the 3 capitals that we visited and we talked to people, seems to be rather uneven. And therefore, we sort of proposed a wider, broad spectrum set of policies from the top down as well as bottom up in the areas of defense, economics, maritime, as well as politics and diplomacy. So the idea is to figure out a strategic triangularity of alignment of key foreign policy focus among the 3 countries. Let me be clear that we're not proposing a formal alliance of the 3 countries in any way, but we are proposing that there has to be a realignment of foreign policy focus if the 3 countries were to provide a new force for strategic stability in the Indo-Pacific. Since COVID, things obviously have changed quite rapidly. I think my colleagues Ben and Premesha will speak more to this from their end later on. But the defense update produced by Australia several weeks ago is a significant signpost for us to understand how Canberra thinks about the region now. The conflict, or rather the crisis and standoff between India and China, I think, have shifted the dynamics quite significantly there. And for Indonesia, while we still deal with the same old issues with regards to the South China Sea, as well as a series of our own challenges with regards to COVID, I think the appetite for figuring out new ways beyond our existing multilateral commitments as well as our existing bilateral partnership, I think is still there. But I do think when it comes to Indonesia, Unfortunately, there are concerns and questions about the extent to which we can integrate the different instruments that Indonesia has, from defense, military, to foreign policy, as well as maritime policy, if we want to talk about what's happening in the South China Sea. Aside from the structural impediments to a coherent national strategy from our own, I think COVID remains the key priority for the government at this point. So while the appetite is there for a long-term engagement on the unilateral side of things, for the time being, at least for the next year or two, I think COVID and its accompanying issues, from public health security to supply chain vulnerability, I think is still high on the agenda. But one thing that I feel we could talk a bit further down the line is figuring out a stronger research and collaboration between the research communities in India, Australia, and Indonesia with regards to public and regional health security, not necessarily in terms of just vaccine development and instruments of public health, but also figuring out what kind of policies and joint collaborative research we can engage in to provide a wider and more public engagement on public health issues of concern. Because let's face it, this is not going to be the last pandemic. We're about to see more public health challenges and disasters in the years ahead. So I think it's time that, at least if we felt that the momentum has shifted a little bit from the strategic driving forces at the regional level, at least when it comes to the health security aspect, I think there's more room for the three countries to work together. And with that, I'll leave it back to Waffa to take us to the next session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Evan. Now I have to ask the same question, similar question to Premesha and Ben. Of course, just like what I asked Evan earlier, I would have to ask you again, what has changed for India and Australia that may change the strategic equation that works to tell us of the importance of this trilateral framework. Of course, we know that India has, for instance, a border tension with China. And then Australia, as Evan mentioned earlier, in recent week have the 2020 Defense Strategic Update. And maybe we can go to you first, Premesha. What's your take on this? What's the perspective in India? Any updates with regards to this report?
You're absolutely right. Even if you see the way India approaches foreign policy or its relation with other partners, it has been mentioned in the report as well that we have always been open to trilaterals and plurilaterals and unilateral frameworks. We have existing trilateral engagements with Russia. We have the Russia, India, China, Japan, India, Australia, and so on and so forth. But currently, given the standoff between India and China, China has always been a threat when it comes to the continental border, but I think the threat has now become a very big reality for us. So given that, we are strengthening our bilateral engagements as well as our trilateral and minilateral engagements with the like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific region. And those countries are US, Japan, Australia, and even with Southeast Asia. So you can see that we are doing joint exercises with the US in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. India has always maintained, as Evan spoke about South China Sea, India has always maintained that it agrees to the freedom of navigation and overflight. But recently, after the US's new stance on the South China Sea, you saw a statement from the Indian side as well, where it mentioned that the South China Sea also, we believe it's a global commons, in a way, a subtle messaging towards China. We have, besides that, we are also in the quadrilateral platform. We are trying to engage India. There has been reports in Australia for long has wanted to join the Malabar exercises, but India, not to irk Chinese sentiments, has not responded to that invitation, has not responded to that willingness from Australian side. But I think now India is planning to engage Australia and add a sort of a hard power component to the already existing quadrilateral dialogue. So these are our ways of sending out subtle messaging to China, besides the economic diplomacy that we are doing from banning several Chinese apps. So for India right now, I think there is a lot more appetite for engaging with countries in the trilateral platform or the type of minilateral platform that we are proposing in our report. So I guess from the Indian side, as I mentioned, the appetite has become much more now. But at the same time, India has always been against joining alliances. So that's why we made it very clear in the report that we are not proposing a formal alliance. Even in a very recent event, Dr. Jaishankar, our External Affairs Minister, made it very clear that most countries are believing that probably India is bandwagoning with the US and so on. But he made it very clear that we are not going to form alliances, because that has not been the way Indian foreign policy operates, and it's going to continue that way. So in those regards, I think such trilateral frameworks and trilateral frameworks keeps us at a safe footing as well. So that's my take.
Yeah, I won't have too much to add. I think I'd make a broader point really to start off about COVID-19 and its effect on international relations, because I think there's a paradox at the heart of this pandemic and how nations have reacted. On the one hand, I think we've seen just how important multilateralism is and how important it should be in a globalized world, when a pandemic can start in China and spread all around the world incredibly quickly at great devastating costs to health and to economies. So we've seen the importance of a multilateral response in theory, but what we've seen in practice from almost every country, and I would include Australia, India and Indonesia in this to a great extent, is unilateral responses that at the end of the day, most governments see health crises as national crises, and even more, they're local crises. So in Australia at the moment, we have states putting up borders internally to block travel as governments try and manage the pandemic. So there's a real paradox at the heart of the pandemic. And I think that's going to be a real challenge going forward for the sorts of cooperation that we were examining in our report, because so long as countries are really looking inwards for the most part, it's going to be harder to do the sorts of things we're talking about. Now, that being said, I would say in the case of Australia, after an initial turn inwards, there has been a lot of diplomatic work done to try and reconnect diplomatic ties in an era of Zoom diplomacy, which is fiendishly difficult, as we all know. So there have been a lot of high-level engagements with the region, which is good. And there are signs that the trilateral dialogue at foreign ministers level and perhaps even defense ministers level could go ahead this year between Australia, India and Indonesia, obviously electronically, most likely not in person. And that would be good if it happens. And that would be a sign that despite the difficulties that all three countries are facing internally at the moment, fighting the pandemic, that there is a commitment at the highest levels to try and push this idea forward. But I think in practice, it's going to be difficult, because all the focus now is really internal on managing these crises. That's what publics want, and that's what governments are going to be responding to.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, I've noted one of your statements that indeed COVID-19 has made countries, especially our leaders, a bit more on the outside, a bit more transactional, a bit more inward looking, if we could say it like that. Meanwhile, I think the report is created on this mindset of a long-term stability, that mindset of the more strategic mindset instead of this more transactional mindset. So how would you think? I think I can ask from Evan again, and then probably we go back to Premesha and Ben. How would you think about the current appetite of this with regards to this trilateral framework in Indonesia, in India, and Australia? Probably you can also make a comparison before and just like what Ben said, after the pandemic now. Maybe we can go to you, Evan.
Sure. The report's key premise is that we are trying to find a few things. One is the convergence of interest. So the premise, the key starting point of the report is that a strategic mindset entails, one, the convergence of interest. And I think on this part, a lot of the strategic interests between India, Australia, and Indonesia have not changed with COVID. We still want a stable rules-based order, whether it's in the maritime domain or at the broader level. We still want multilateral, and all kinds of cooperation to be the norm rather than the exception. Two, there are some shared values that we share. For example, we're all three maritime democracies, and to some extent, that hasn't changed as well, I think, between the three countries. And lastly, that the three countries share relatively similar power structures and positions within the Indo-Pacific. That hasn't changed as well. So I think the key building blocks of the strategic understanding of what we thought to be the key driving force of a potential triangularity between India, Australia, and Indonesia, I think has not changed. The issue, of course, is that the attention of the policymakers, I think, have changed quite significantly. On Indonesia's side, it is rather difficult to make the case that the president himself has always been interested in geopolitical posturing and nuances. So on that front, that hasn't changed as well. But I do think that the key policymakers in the foreign policy realm, defense policy realm, and even in the maritime policy realm, I think are still trying to drive the wider engagement with the region moving forward. So while there's no personal changes in how the president himself considers the broader regional outlook, I think the key political and policy driving forces from within Indonesia are still there. But of course, Ben is absolutely right that in the era of COVID, the agenda is pretty much changed significantly. In terms of foreign policy, it is hard not to open the news and look at our foreign ministry officials talk about vaccine cooperation rather than geopolitical or regional security challenges. But that doesn't mean, I think, that we are simply ignoring the problem and hoping they'll go away by themselves. It's just that there are less exposure and less public new initiatives, and there's probably less energy to engage in these new initiatives. But as I said earlier, because the strategic interest and the building blocks between India, Australia, and Indonesia, I think, still remains. I think rather than expecting a top-down new initiative at the foreign ministry level, at the foreign minister's level, for example, maybe there's more room to work with from a bottom-up approach and focus on a track 2 level and engage in research on public health or health security. So I think the appetite at the track 2 level, I think, is still there. The issue areas to work with, I think, is still there. Although right now, one has to take into account health a lot more than just the maritime domain, for example, at least for the time being. So I think from that front, Indonesia is still open to these track 2 initiatives and research engagements. But at the wider level, I think the problems that we face in the Indo-Pacific and the convergence of interest, shared values, and power positions, I think, will eventually bring the three countries back to the table once kind of the horrible wave of COVID has sort of slowed down.
We can hand over to Premesha.
Yeah, thanks, Waffa, for the question. I would actually take off from where Evan left. He spoke about shared interest in the building blocks. I think from the Indian standpoint, right now, besides COVID, as you mentioned in your first question, we are tackling with a very real threat, which is the India-China border clashes. So for us, I think besides tackling COVID, engaging with other countries has also become a reality. We cannot just focus on COVID right now, though that is the major focus of the government in boosting the economy, developing the health infrastructure, and so on and so forth. But besides that, our foreign policy matters have also gained equal importance for us currently. So one of the aspects that the report pointed out was, even Evan mentioned at the outset, was strengthening of the bilateral relations, or strengthening each triangle of the bilateral relations. We have mentioned that in the report, and you can see from the Indian side, we had the very first virtual summit with Australia, where we signed plenty of agreements, the most noteworthy being the logistics sharing agreement that we signed with Australia. We saw a recent visit by the Indonesian defense minister in India, where also they spoke of strengthening of defense cooperation, and probably more of defense procurement. Besides all this, I think even the maritime domain, because many in the scholarly community in India has long championed that though we do not face currently we are not facing a very real threat from China in the maritime domain, besides the circling that we are facing in terms of it developing very strong relations with the South Asian neighbors and stuff like that. But India also needs to now strengthen its presence in the Western Pacific or the Eastern Indian Ocean. And for that, being in the good books of strengthening cooperation with countries like Australia, Indonesia, who have a much better presence in this region becomes important for us. Another important strategic convergence that the three countries have towards the Indo-Pacific is that all the three consider ASEAN centrality as very important. For India, ASEAN centrality is the primary tenet in its Indo-Pacific policy. So, and the same goes on for Australia and Indonesia. So I think the three cooperating in Southeast Asia is a very opportune thing, and it's something which the three countries want to do, and I think that also in a way drives this trilateral cooperation. But at the same time, I would agree with Evan and Ben that currently I think we have to think more about cooperating from the health security domain, and I think in that also India can push the way, because currently we are the chairman of the World Health Assembly. So we have to try and engage as many players, learn from each other's experiences, learn from each other's faults, and try to come up with a more cohorted response towards COVID. And I think in that also, given India's position right now in the World Health Organization, we can push the way and engage more with our Indo-Pacific partners. Yeah, that's my point.
Thank you, Premesha. Can we go to Ben now?
Well, having made some, I guess, rather bleak remarks earlier, I would sort of give a bit of a corrective by saying it's amazing how much has been done and is being done diplomatically despite the challenges. So obviously, Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Narendra Modi had a good virtual summit. President Jokowi was obviously in Australia just before the outbreak of COVID in Indonesia for a personal summit. So those sides of the triangle that Evan was talking about, we can really see improving. And as I said, it would be positive if we do move to some sort of virtual minister level dialogue this year at foreign minister level, which I know the governments are committed to, and perhaps even the defense minister level too, because for my mind, this isn't just about having shared values on everything. Of course, there are many things on which Australia, India, and Indonesia disagree. But I think these are three really important countries in the region who need to develop better habits of cooperation, not just talking to each other as a three, but as Premesha was saying, when it comes to the World Health Organization, when it comes to the World Trade Organization, organizations that really are in peril at the moment, largely because of the Trump administration, not exclusively. It's really important that these three countries, I think you'd probably say that India and Indonesia are great powers or rising powers, Australia probably a middle power, but at the moment they all in their own different ways have a similar kind of weight, bringing different things to the table. So I think there's just great value in deepening that strategic conversation at a ministerial level, just being able to have more honest and frank conversations about how all three ministers at a foreign minister and defense minister level see the world, how they see the region. I think that's really important, and that will take time to build that trust, and it's obviously done much more easily in person rather than over web calls. But I think the fact that that's going ahead is a positive sign that there is a certain high level of commitment. In the end, I think for this sort of arrangement to work, you need both a top-down high-level commitment, but you do also need something from the bottom up, as everyone was saying, and invariably politicians being politicians, you need some kind of announceables. So there has to be some move to develop some sort of projects with actual outcomes, although these things are fiendishly hard and there's often a debate about whether it's worthwhile doing it trilaterally or not. But I think at the end of the day, politically, that will become essential if this is to move on and the dialogue is to be sustained rather than be dropped, which I know is what happened before with an earlier track 1.5 incarnation around the Indian Ocean. It didn't really go anywhere because there wasn't enough high-level support and there wasn't enough meat on the bone. So I think you need top-down and bottom-up, and there are positive signs that despite the tricky times we're in, there is a good level of commitment from all three sides to try and push this idea ahead. But I think in the end of the day, you're going to need a bit of a trial and error approach, try different things, see what works. We're not talking about alliances, but minilateralism, which is something more practical, more pragmatic.
Thank you, Ben. I would just like to continue on some of the points that you've mentioned. I've also seen that I think the Q&A bar has been filled. Some has already put on some questions. If others would like to as well, you can put it now on the Q&A panels. But I would just like to continue on your point, Ben, with regards to those, I think, debate between where should we go first? Is it a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach to initiate things? And you said that we need to do it both ways at the same time. And there's also a debate between what actually bring these three countries together. Is it more of their values, or is it more of their interest? Now, along this sort of thoughts, so where are we supposed to start? Where should we start with? What sort of areas? Which agencies should meet? Where can we start this sort of initiation first? I think I've seen in your report that you've divided it from a short-term and medium-term and long-term sort of framework. So yeah, can you elaborate on this sort of framework? Can we go to Premesha first, I guess?
Yeah. So I think currently, as both my colleagues pointed out, the report was written in the pre-COVID era. So we mentioned different spectrums that cooperation can be strengthened. Maritime domain was one, defense and security was one, economic was one. But I think currently, as both Evan and Ben pointed out, I think convergence has to come from a bottom-up approach when we are looking at research and development, probably more track 1.5, track 2 engagements, talking about global health security, talking about collaboration, not just in terms of vaccine development. I know for reality that in India, we need to learn more from our partners as to how we can strengthen our health infrastructure. Because seeing the way currently India is responding to the crisis, I think this is the main concern that we have, that our health infrastructure is not as strong as it is supposed to be. So in those regards, collaborating with our partners has become important. So I guess in those lines, probably we can bring in the Indian Council of Medical Research and similar organizations in Australia and Indonesia to sit on the table, exchange the best practices and talk about how best to improve the health scenario in all the three countries. As I said, before India's joining as the chairman in the World Health Assembly, both Australia and other partners tried to persuade India to engage with more countries in the World Health Organization platform. So I think this is another case where all the three countries can talk. And as Ben correctly said, that there's the need for multilateral organizations currently has become the most important necessity right now. So strengthening of the World Health Organizations, the decision-making, the executive working body. For that, I think the three countries, it provides a good platform that one is now sitting at the chair. So it gives that push to for the three countries to come together. Besides that, I think the next aspect which I would like to focus is the maritime domain. Because the three countries, be it Australia, be it India, be it Indonesia, all the three, I think in some way are engaged in the South China Sea dispute. Indonesia, obviously for the Natunas, but Australia and India, though being external players to the dispute, have shown equal interest, have shown equal urge to sort of contain Chinese aggressive actions in this region. So I think cooperation in the maritime domain between the coast guards, between the navies, and or even in a track 1.5 where the three can talk about, I think, how they see maritime law, how they see the involvement of UNCLOS, because Indonesia has been one of the premiers when we talk about the UNCLOS. So, these kind of discussions can currently take place, because as Evan clearly said, that we still want a rule-based order, we still want a free and open Indo-Pacific. So I think discussing UNCLOS, talking about how more we can enforce UNCLOS and how the three countries can also come up with what to say, help ASEAN in coming out with a plausible code of conduct, because those discussions are also going on in the with regard to bringing peace in the South China Sea. I think these are the two agencies, health and maritime, currently, I think, which will gain a lot more importance than the other ones.
Thank you, Premesha. Can we go to Ben on these? Where do we start? Where can we initiate the cooperation?
I think the key is not to be too ambitious, which is a strange thing to say. But what we're talking about here is something that's very long term. And to my mind, as I was suggesting earlier, it's really about deepening the conversation at a strategic level between these three countries at a, of course, ministerial level, officials level, the sort of track to discussions we're having here. I think that's really got to be the driving force. So you don't need to be too ambitious. And I think what we tried to do in the report was sort of have a kind of menu of things that people can choose. It's not meant to be a prescriptive set of guidelines that must be followed. It's a series of ideas to try and get officials and others in all three countries thinking about the sorts of things that they can work together. And I personally don't like the talk of strategic convergence. I think it's more about overlapping strategic interests, because I'm not sure even Australia and India, Australia and Indonesia, India and Indonesia are converging in the way they see everything. There are so many differences, but there are certainly a lot of overlapping interests, and probably more overlapping interests now than there have been for a long time, and better bilateral relationships on all three sides than there have been for a long time too. So I think it's more about how can you deepen that conversation. That's really what it's about. And one of the challenges there, if we're being frank, is that I think this idea has always been driven more from Canberra than from the other capitals. I think that's partly a capacity issue, and partly because I think India and Indonesia are really busy with their own kind of internal security challenges, border security issues with China and other questions. So they actually don't have as much time and capacity to think about these sort of strategic questions as Australia, being very far away, surrounded by friends and fish, has more time to work on it. So I think there's a bit of a disparity there in how the different governments look at the question of cooperation, which is a challenge. And then the other issue is kind of China, the elephant in the room, because at the end of the day, the strategic driver for these sorts of conversations is to a great extent, but not exclusively, about China and wanting to have a way to maintain the existing order in the region as China seeks to overturn it, or at least to bend the order to its interests. But I think India, to a lesser extent, and certainly Indonesia, are very reluctant to frame this sort of cooperation, these sorts of dialogues around those issues publicly, because they obviously cherish their strategic autonomy highly. So it's a really delicate conversation when the real driving factor is the one thing that you can't talk about too explicitly, at least in government forums. So I think that's going to be another challenge to overcome. But certainly you would hope that behind closed doors, at a high level, officials would be able to have these sorts of conversations on a more frank basis.
Thank you, Ben. Stefan, would you like to have some comments?
Sure. Just to pick up from what Ben and Premesha have been saying, I think when it comes to integrating both goals and processes, the goals, which is to improve the habits of cooperation based on existing modalities, existing processes that we already have. So Premesha mentioned, for example, on the maritime domain, the Navy, in our report, for example, we looked at how the Navy has been very central in the relationship between the three countries. So we have something to start with. We're not starting with a blank slate, but because of what Ben said, the different appetites and the different issues, some of which are overlapping interests, some of which are not, we try to offer a series of options. But the idea is that in an ideal world, it would be nice if we can do two things. One, improve the bilateral relationship for each side of the triangle while we figure out some of these new options for the trilateral framework. And I think the bilateral aspect in particular, I think is sort of underdeveloped. India and Indonesia in particular, by most measures, history, culture, geographic proximity and all that, by most measures, India and Indonesia should be a lot closer as strategic partners than we are today. Up until like last year, we didn't even have a direct flight between Jakarta and Delhi. So to a large extent, I think if we might have some reluctance or different types of appetite from the three countries about a trilateral framework, at the very least, we can improve the bilateral side of things. And in our report, we identify from an economic standpoint, from a political diplomatic standpoint, as well as military to military standpoint, perhaps Indonesia and Australia has the more institutionalized and longer duration in terms of those kinds of relationships, and India and Indonesia is the least developed and institutionalized. So if we need to slowly start figuring out some of the trilateral issues, whether it's the top-down aspects or more track two bottom-up approaches, from maritime security to health security to UNCLOS, for example. And I think there's a lot of room for coordination. I think the fact that Australia joined the note verbal to the UN on the UN Commission on continental shelf and reiterated the illegality of some of China's claims in the South China Sea. I think it's a good way to show that there are some areas in which our interests do overlap. We should coordinate more. We should talk about how we can do things together more. But while that's still brewing, I think the bilateral side of things needs work. And I think in particular, the relationship between India and Indonesia that needs more work. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. Now, I'll probably just pick some of the questions that you guys have inputted in the Q&A section. And I think I'll go back to you again, Evan, because one of them is being designated to you specifically. And again, four questions ask about China, obviously, of course. The first one is Angela Ujaya, who suggested that, of course, being with noting that India's and Australia's involvement with the Quad, the quadrilateral security dialogue, would you agree that this trilateral cooperation might risk provoking China? This is a question from Angela Wijaya, and then another about China, from Ian Montratama of President University, suggesting, can we say that this trilateral is a way to balance China's threat? So that's two questions from a different spectrum. And another one from Halden Cape, who suggested that, of course, the elephant in the room with regards to problems and issues in the region is China. How will this trilateral address this main issue? So three questions about China. And lastly, a suggestion from Santo Darmo Sumarto from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Indonesia, who also mentioned something about China, who suggested that would this cooperation just be seen as another anti-China front? And he mentioned that will the successful development of this trilateral cooperation be more of an issue of timing? And he also said that in this regard, a bottom-up approach to developing this trilateral project could buy time before a top-down approach could evolve without being impacted by current geopolitical challenges. So with that, I go to Evan first. 4 questions, mostly mentioning about China.
Sure. The question about China is actually something that we've discussed a lot, and throughout our research, both in terms of what we read in the literature as well as in our conversations with policymakers in Canberra, Delhi, in Jakarta, it is hard to avoid. As Ben said earlier, it is not all about China, but it is still definitely high on the agenda. But I do want to say that one, unlike the Quad, I think the highlight of what we're proposing isn't necessarily about a particular set of disputed issues like the South China Sea and others, but we do try to frame it in a much larger way that, okay, when we have a larger cooperation and we focus it on the Indo-Pacific as a whole, will it touch on issues that are related to China? Sure, but it is not designed just to contain China. In fact, the idea of strengthening economic cooperation, the idea of improving maritime domain awareness, the idea of pushing a rules-based order at the maritime domain is also beneficial for China. And the fact that Indonesia, if there is appetite, I think out of these three countries, if I can be candid, I think probably Indonesia is the one that sort of had the most stable and quietly productive relationship with China, and less confrontational. So in that sense, I think hopefully the way that Indonesia can help shape the agenda of the trilateral framework can sort of put to rest some of the concerns that this is just an anti-China coalition or you know, either a U.S. ally or China's enemies at the border. Indonesia is not a claimant state in the South China Sea. We have no particular strong security issues to deal with yet. So I think Indonesia's involvement would be the key, and in terms of how we can present the trilateral cooperation as not just an anti-China thing and more of an Indo-Pacific thing. And the question about timing, I think is absolutely crucial, because it is true that one cannot rush too soon. Diplomatic, military resources are all stretched thin, especially in this pandemic era, which is why we propose some of a more low-key track 2 initiatives. And now we can talk about public health and regional health security as part of the conversation. But as I said earlier, the key strategic interests that should, in theory, push these three countries to work closer together has not gone away, and probably won't for the near future. So while we figure out how to improve the bilateral relationship that forms each side of the triangle, we can still work on some of the issues that are of common concern for the three countries, whether it's in the maritime domain or health security. But I guess the key line for all of these questions about China is that, yes, it is hard to deny that the regional strategic flux that has plagued the region and affected India, Australia, and Indonesia are to a large extent shaped by China's rise, and now in particular by the strategic competition between US and China, not just China alone. But the way we respond shouldn't be just driven to address China or US-China competition alone. The whole idea of a larger framework is to figure out the wider regional framework and some of the key issues. If that helps along the way to mitigate or reduce some of the tension in the US-China conflict, or hopefully can bring in China into the fold a lot more productively, then all the better. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Evan. Can we go to Ben for comments about these questions about China?
Yeah, I'll just make two really brief points, actually. I mean, the first thing I'd say is I don't think any country should worry what Beijing thinks, right? I mean, these are three G20 economies, three democracies, albeit none of them perfect, as no democracy is, but three democracies, three G20 economies, three countries that together anchor the Indian Ocean in Indo-Pacific region. I was also pleased to see President Jokowi used our anchoring the Indo-Pacific terminology in his speech in Parliament in Canberra in February, which was good. But there's no reason why these three countries shouldn't get together at a ministerial or any other level and talk. And I think it's no one's business at the end of the day if they want to do that. So I think there should be no fear for Indonesia or for India. And I think we've seen things moving on. I think these meetings will happen this year, I suspect. And actually, in a way, the pandemic makes it easier because they can be done over a web conference. It can be done much more quickly than if it was an in-person meeting. So I'm hopeful that it will actually happen either at foreign or defense minister level this year. And that's the first point. The second thing I'd say is, of course, it's not just about China. It's about the global system we have. And a large part of the threat to that now is the US. As I suggested earlier, if you look at the World Health Organization and the US pullout, you look at the World Trade Organization and the mess it's in right now, just two examples that have really been affected by US unilateralism in the era of Trump. You can also look at the climate change question as well, although maybe these three countries don't have the greatest record there either. But I think it's important because of the way the US is changing too, that other countries have to pull more weight. And that's going to take the likes of India, Australia, and Indonesia, not exclusively, but these three countries are really important in trying to make the system we have work, not just because of the way China is changing, but because of the way the US is changing. And now it's really a test, I think, of Indonesia, of Australia, of India. How much are we willing to put into the game to make this order that we all talk about work? Because it's going to take effort, it's going to take money, it's going to take risk. And I think it's a real test, and it's not in any way just about China. It's about the US too, and how our world is changing. And I think it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out, because things are really getting real now. And the pandemic is a great test of our institutions. And I think so far we haven't done that well in defending them, but I'm hoping we're moving out of this kind of initial unilateral phase into something more cooperative.
Thank you, Ben. Premesha, any comments?
Yeah, I think both of my colleagues have commented on have already cleared the air on that. It has to be seen from a much broader aspect besides the China threat. They have used, as Evan very clearly mentioned about the Indo-Pacific. If we are looking at Indo-Pacific, it's a much bigger picture than the China threat that we're talking about. But I would like to mention a few things from the Indian standpoint, because I think it's mainly given the competition that India and China are also facing, probably that is from also where this question arises. Because I saw that there was a mention of the quadrilateral. One thing which India has from the beginning, I think if somebody reads in carefully into the 2018 keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue by Prime Minister Modi, he very clearly mentioned that for India, Indo-Pacific is not just the countries which have a geographical stake, but also stake otherwise. And that includes Russia and China, the two countries who have looked at the Indo-Pacific vision through suspicious lens. India has long been championing that Russia should also be included in the Indo-Pacific, and no discussion on the Indo-Pacific can happen without including Russia. So you can see that including other players have not, India has not shunned away from the fact that we need to include other players in the picture as well. Besides that, I think when India was talking about when we were talking about reinitiating the Quad and stuff, I think the major challenge with the Indian policymakers faced was how to give out the message to the world that Quad is just one of the initiatives of the Indo-Pacific. It is not India's vision of the Indo-Pacific, because India's vision of the Indo-Pacific is much wider. And I think that is why we chose the term anchoring the Indo-Pacific and not just the Indian Ocean, because it looks at the other spectrum as well. So if you look in our report, we have also mentioned that the three countries can work in a third region, and that is the Pacific Island countries, also to show that how the Pacific and the South Pacific, which has been mainly Australia and Indonesia's house of interest, is also now India's house of interest, to show that we are having, we are broadening our focus, we are broadening our foreign policy goals, and we are broadening the geography. That is primarily what Act East is. That is where the difference between Look East and Act East is, where Act East now has a much broader geographic focus. So on goes for our maritime doctrine as well. So these kind of issues, I think, and it's time, as Ben very clearly mentioned, and so did Evan, that we have to now think of policies. We do not just talk about, anti-China. It's much bigger than that. It has to be a stable rule-based order. And for that, I think all the three countries have to show in their weight. And the three countries are also the key players of IORA. So I think that is another key aspect that needs to be looked into, that it's the three countries are also the anchors in the IORA and the Indian Ocean region. So it's basically, it's time that we pull in our weight. We show that at a time when US's influence is dwindling in the region, and there is too much of focus on the US-China strategic competition, that how other players, how middle players, how rising powers can also pull in their weight and ensure a stable global order.
Now, there are two questions mentioning ASEAN, and I think I'll go to Evan and Ben for this one. The first one from Rocky Intan from CSIS Indonesia, who asked for Ben specifically about where do ASEAN and its outlook on Indo-Pacific fit within this trilateral cooperation, especially among Australia and Indonesia. And then another question from Berlian Helmi of the National Resilience Institute, who asked about, in relation with ASEAN, how could ASEAN be solid while China's assertiveness irritates relations with India and Australia? Again, a China question, but now related with ASEAN. Ben, any comments?
Well, I'm not a big fan of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, I'm sorry to say, to my Indonesian friends. I know that a lot of work was put into pushing it through. But when I talk to diplomats from other ASEAN nations, they point out, there's a reason why it's called an outlook and not a policy or anything else, because they weren't so keen on it. And to my mind, it's a restatement of ASEAN's core principles, which are really good principles, by the way. And obviously, Australia and India have been really supportive of the outlook, but I think because they see it as a way that Indonesia is showing its ambition to raise its voice. So I think it's good in that. But I don't really see anything substantive in there that would impact on this trilateral relationship. I think, if anything, presentationally, the fact that Delhi and Canberra are on board with the idea is sort of good diplomatically, because the three sides can mention it in their statements, as they have done. But I don't think there's much substance there in the first place. That would be my view.
Can we go to Evan now?
Sure. Thank you for the question on ASEAN's solidity. A couple things. I think the fact that ASEAN is fractured is not just because of China. I think China is a huge instigator and a huge factor in the last few years, obviously, especially as it relates to the South China Sea. But part of the responsibility, I think, lies within ASEAN and within Indonesia itself. One, I think we have gotten nowhere in terms of reforming the ASEAN Secretariat, figuring out the budget structure and how to make the meetings more productive and more meaningful, figuring out how we can institutionalize the East Asia Summit, for example. So a lot of the reform agendas on our side has not been completed yet. One key aspect that's relevant to the cohesion of ASEAN has to do with the ASEAN integration stuff. The fact that we, in particular those in maritime Southeast Asia, have not been fully engaging with our friends in mainland Southeast Asia is part of the reasons why some in mainland Southeast Asia felt they would rather bandwagon with China than with their fellow ASEAN partners. So I think trying to get on in terms of completing the ASEAN integration project, the three pillars of the ASEAN community, we have the blueprint on how to do it, but we just haven't gotten around to doing it well and doing it fast enough. And I think a part of the problem is that every year our agenda has always been hijacked by the South China Sea and others, for good or for worse. And lastly, I think from Indonesia's standpoint, regardless of the problems of a rotational chair system with regards to ASEAN, it will always vary, right? Because of the rotational chair system. The problem, I think, is the missing leadership aspect of Indonesia. I think the leadership vacuum that Indonesia has left over the last 6 years, I think has left ASEAN sort of drifting right, left, and center. And I think this is the part where it's Indonesia's responsibility to not only come to the meetings and propose sentences to the joint statement or even the ASEAN outlook. And on this, I have to share Ben's skepticism of the ASEAN outlook, that it is nothing more than a restatement of existing norms and policies. There's no new ideas, no policies, and not even resources or strategy. If Indonesia is the one that proposes the ASEAN outlook in the first place, what does Indonesia propose to do after we have the ASEAN outlook? In the past, there were discussions of an Indo-Pacific infrastructure summit, but summits are not equivalents to strategies. And we don't have that yet. We don't have the strategy to lead ASEAN, regardless of who's the ASEAN chair, and figuring out how to address some of the ASEAN's key challenges, whether it's the South China Sea or ASEAN integration. So for us, for me in particular, I think it is the missing leadership aspect of Indonesia and ASEAN's inability to move forward on some of its key reform agenda that's partially to blame for the lack of cohesion. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. Now I'd like to read some more questions. I have here around five questions with regards to what I call some concerns, challenges or spoilers to this trilateral cooperation. Some factors, different ones mentioned here. First is from Rocky Intan, and I think this question is specifically for Ben. With regards to DFAT's budget cuts, how do the budget cuts of DFAT square with the need for Canberra to increase its engagement in the Pacific? So that's the first one from Rocky Intan. And then another question is from Ambassador McCarthy. What degree of religious factors are religious factors between Indonesia and India likely to impede this trilateral arrangement if Modi continues pressures against Muslim minority in India? And this is, I think, a question for Premesha. Premesha, if you'd like to give some comments for this one. And then I'll take two more, which I think one question from Puji Pratama from the National Armed Forces, and then from Tri Rahayu Masari, who both ask about the assessment of this trilateral cooperation and its impact to Indonesia's interest, particularly whether Indonesia can get a fair trade or a fair trade-off in this trilateral setting. Can Indonesia get the same benefit as of others, as well as has the positive impacts overweigh the negative ones? And I think this question is for Evan. So I think we can start from these three questions. Maybe we can go to Ben first.
It's a really good question, Rocky. Thanks for that. And I think you're onto something there. There's a lot of frustration, I think, at the moment within DFAT about the pressure that's being placed on them to do more with less. I think the pandemic has used up a lot of resources, of course, but beyond that, I think we've seen in the last few years the trend of the development assistance budget to be shrinking. And what we've seen with Canberra's step up in the Pacific is it's effectively sucked away a shrinking or static pool of resources to one area. And that invariably means less for Southeast Asia and for other areas. And I think it's a big challenge. We've got to remember Australia is a middle power. Its diplomatic network, I think, is smaller than the likes of Portugal, Chile, South Africa. So there is a real pull on resources. And this was one of the things when Premesha and I were in Canberra talking to people across defense and DFAT, there's a strain on resources, and Australia feels that too in the same way that India and Indonesia do. So I think that is going to be a challenge going forward, because governments always want diplomats to do more with less, but it's not possible. Diplomacy costs money, development assistance costs money, and unless you have the bucks going to the right places, I'm afraid the other stuff is not going to follow. So this is something that definitely needs to be addressed in the years to come if this thing is going to move ahead.
Thank you, Ben. Can we go to Premesha about the question of how is the impact of the religious factors?
I think more than religion, what we need to remember is that both the countries are democracies. India is the biggest democracy, and though secularism has taken a hit with mainly the Kashmir policy and how the steps that have been taken in Kashmir and the minorities there, but I think when it comes to India-Indonesia cooperation, I think the premise that has driven this bilateral cooperation is the fact that we both are democracies. And as Evan also clearly mentioned, I think now, given that we are speaking about the Indo-Pacific, we have to focus on the fact that we both are maritime democracies. And I think that should be the main driving factor when we are talking about cooperation between these two countries. And if we see the recent developments, the Modi government has been in power for quite some time now. This is the second tenure. Given, I think, the 2018 visit by President Jokowi or the recent developments that we are seeing in the India-Indonesia relations, I think religion has not so much hindered the cooperation between these two countries. as much as maybe India-Malaysia has, but not the India-Indonesia relations, I don't think has been impeded by the religion question. Because I think the focus has mainly been on the democratic aspect and currently maybe the Indo-Pacific, because if we see the shared vision statement, it was again a shared vision statement for maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So I think right now the two driving pillars are the fact that we are democracies and the Indo-Pacific question. So I don't think the religion question is going to factor in so much in this trilateral cooperation.
Thank you, Premesha. I'm going to go to Eva now. There was a question about whether Indonesia will be have a fair trade-off in this trilateral cooperation compared to others.
Sure. Let me just add on just very quickly to what Premesha was saying. I think the fact that some can ask whether or not religious issues could affect India-Indonesia relations, I think just goes on to tell us that we do need more, not less, engagement between India and Indonesia, more frequency and more intensity across all layers, from the government to civil society groups and research institutions. I think the lack of understanding between the two countries and the two nations over the last few decades, I think are an issue that we should address. Going back to the question about the potential benefits in a trilateral framework for Indonesia. So basically, asking why should Indonesia want to do this? For me, one big answer is simply that Indonesia needs more tools. We need to expand our strategic options in the region beyond everything has to do with ASEAN or everything has to do with bilateral ties. And I think the fact that we're constrained in our strategic options is precisely why we need to find new options. And I think in the Indo-Pacific, our best option right now at the table is to figure out how we can collaborate and work closer together with India and Australia. And here's a couple of potential new toolkits and options if we were to have such a trilateral framework. I think from a military standpoint, historically, Indonesia have had the best ties with Singapore, Malaysia, Australia, and to a large extent, the US. But on our Indian Ocean flank, we're very much underdeveloped. Our relationship with India is underdeveloped, and our capacity to help manage the maritime domain in the Indian Ocean side of things is unevenly skewed towards the Pacific rather than towards the Indian. So while we are literally in the center of the Indian and the Pacific Oceans, a lot of our energy and history have been spent more on the Pacific rather than on the Indian Ocean. So we need more strategic options in the Indian Ocean. Diplomatically, we also need to figure out when we are living at a time when a major crisis are likely to hit us successively and quite quick. We cannot wait for the wheels of multilateralism to always provide us the most rapid, ready response. If we don't have that option beyond multilateralism, then what do we have? And I think figuring out how to work closer together with India and Australia provide us at least some other diplomatic options. We already have good relationships with South Korea and Japan, for example, but we don't have a trilateral framework for our regional partners like Australia and India. Economically as well, I think figuring out how we can work closer together on issues of infrastructure and connectivity for a region where the geoeconomics of trade still flows through the waters that follows and surrounding the three countries, I think is a necessary hedge in these uncertain times. So I think the key theme for me, why should Indonesia even consider this trilateral framework, is simply we need more options. And at a time of uncertainty, more options is definitely better than less options. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. Now, I've got two questions about whether between the three countries, whether past tensions and the different values between them will be factors that might hinder the trilateral cooperation. One is from the anonymous attendee. The other one is from Rene Patirajawane, who specifically asked about an event in May where PM Boris Johnson forged a sort of a coalition between 10 leading democracies between G7, Australia, India, and South Korea, dubbed the D10, but Indonesia, who's in this report mentioned as a maritime democracy, is not included in one of these democratic countries. So is this a sort of a symbol of that there may be different values ultimately between these countries, and that might hinder the trilateral cooperation eventually? So I think maybe we can start from Ben first for comments of this.
Well, I think it's always a challenge in foreign policy, because I think there's this false dichotomy that's created between values and interests. But the best relationships are always going to have strong shared values and strong shared interests. But in between, there's a whole variety. You can have strong relationships with countries where you have a lot of shared interests and no shared values, or a lot of shared interests but actually very few shared values. So I think it's not an issue. ASEAN does a great job of cooperating despite having a whole array of different kinds of government, from a sultanate to communist dictatorship to democracies like Indonesia. So I think there's no issue there. What you need is a better relationship, as Evan was saying, so that you're able to disagree. And I think certainly in the case of Australia and Indonesia, I've been really impressed by how, famous last words, by how the relationship has matured over the last few years. So that, for example, both countries were able to sign a trade agreement in the midst of elections in both countries, coming just after the dispute over the possible move of the Australian embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. So in the past, I think that kind of issue, especially coming in an election, would really have blown the relationship off course. But I think there was a determination on both sides at the political level to say, hey, we disagree on this, but we're going to be mature about it. We're not going to let this blow the whole relationship up. And that's a normal relationship that many countries have with each other, but it relies on trust and relationships. And my hope would be that things like these sorts of trilateral dialogues will help to build that trust, so that you can see past where there are differences of opinion over values as well as interest, which is obviously going to happen.
We go to Premesha. Any comments, Premesha?
Yeah, so to take off from where Ben left off, I think the question, when we are talking about the Indo-Pacific, and I think it has been an agreed point that though the values which all the countries which are championing the concept of the Indo-Pacific, they essentially agree on what are the values that should be underlying this region, but I think the strategies and policies have differed. And that is a lot based on the interest of the countries or the threats that they face. So that difference, as Ben very clearly pointed out, will always remain when we talk about foreign policy. Because in a way, it is always governed by national interests, though it's foreign policy. But as far as, but I think in a way, that's why maybe this question, I think, gives us the opportunity, or in a way, it shows how significant now these trilateral frameworks have become. And I think if this gives an opportunity to both India and Australia to maybe push a case where ASEAN should also be seen in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that in a way questions also the ASEAN outlook, as Ben and Evan both pointed out, that maybe ASEAN also needs to be more active in the Indo-Pacific, not just ASEAN, all the countries need to be more active. So does UK in itself. But I think the fact that strategies and policies are different, I think that will always remain. But essentially, we need to just believe and keep our fingers crossed that the values are the same. So this gives an opportunity to countries like India and Australia to push for giving space to countries like Indonesia, Singapore, who are also important Indo-Pacific players, to be included in such discussions, I think.
Premesha, can we go to Evan?
Sure.
For comments?
I think a couple of potentially interesting points about the D10 and whether or not this hinders the trilateral cooperation. At a larger point, when it comes to affecting strategic outcomes in the region, I think the end is near for us to rely on the great powers to save us. That only when the most powerful and the richest get together, and then we can be saved. I think expecting too much out of D10 or whatever groupings are being developed, I think is a fool's errand. I think, unfortunately, right now, given the situation. It is largely, as Ben said, every country for itself. It shouldn't be the case, but that's the reality we deal with right now. So whatever D10 is developing, and that's their initiatives, it shouldn't affect how we consider our options in the region. Now, whether or not this D10, whether or not they actually hinder trilateral cooperation, I think foreign policy options and instruments, whether it's a membership of an alliance or membership of a multilateral institution or strategic partnerships, they're not mutually exclusive. One can be an ally of the US and a member of ASEAN, as Thailand and the Philippines, right? So if Australia were to be a member of the D10, that doesn't mean Australia cannot still engage with us and India in the Indo-Pacific. So a membership in one grouping doesn't exclude you from another grouping's membership. And in fact, if Australia is a member of D10 and India is a member of another and Indonesia is a member of another, I think that's actually the more the better, which means India, Australia, and Indonesia can each bring their own strengths and their own set of foreign policy instruments and memberships and groupings to the table. So there is no serious impediment to Australia's participation in a potential D10 for the trilateral framework. Whether or not that sucks the agenda of the trilateral framework into much more nuance with regards to a great power politics, I think that's something that we can all discuss together. But I'm not seeing why Australia's membership in a D10 necessarily means that we cannot have a trilateral cooperation.
To all three speakers we have today. There are two questions actually, but I think one key point that can be summarized between these two questions is the big question is about so whether should this trilateral group just be a group to complement all regional cooperations, all other multilateral cooperations in the Indo-Pacific region. That's the key point of the questions. The two questions is from Andre Omer Siregar of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the other one is from Rene Patirajawane. From Andre Omer Siregar, he asked about, of course, in the context he was mentioning, Indonesia is planning to host the WEF ASEAN Indo-Pacific Infrastructure Connectivity Forum in July 2021. India is promoting a legal framework in the Indian Ocean and the New Delhi Consensus in IORA, and France and Italy and EU are looking for engaging further in the Indo-Pacific. He asked about whether this Indo-Pacific trilateral cooperation should be a geopolitical strategy or a geo-economic one. And he asked also about whether, as I've mentioned earlier, whether this group is simply a complement to all the other regional cooperations in the region. And similarly, Rene Patirajawane also asked about whether the existing multilateral adjustments has been enough to create a new applicable equilibrium of powers in the region, and that the urgency of this trilateral cooperation actually it's only about this sort of areas that we need to work on, this domain of diplomacy and politics, defense and security, economic and sustainable development, and maritime as the core ideas. Why not bring this into existing multilateral forums and adjustments? So these are the two questions. I think we can start from Premesha first.
Yeah, I think the question on whether Indo-Pacific should be looked at as a geo-economic or geopolitical, I think it should be looked at as both. Because strategically, I think we have discussed a lot already in this conference, what are the strategic connotations that drives the Indo-Pacific. But I think economically, we have not discussed much, so I'll focus on that. So economically, I think the Indo-Pacific in itself provides a lot of opportunities when we are talking about the various infrastructure initiatives that are being taken by the countries involved in the region. So I think, like for instance, India and Indonesia are doing quite a lot. I think recently also there was a conference which was organized by one of the Indian stakeholders on possibilities of connectivity within the Andaman and the Aceh. So for instance, there was a huge hue and cry when the access to Sabang port was declared by the then defense minister, but I think no development happened after that. There was no concrete development. And I think even Evan would agree, when we were writing the report, we could not find any concrete developments happening in that region. So I think, these kind of aspects, and given Australia's experience in terms of development finance, providing such things. So as Evan pointed out, that we have to play into each other's strengths. So infrastructure, maritime connectivity, maritime infrastructure is something which is not much of an explored area. So I think that I think Indo-Pacific should be looked at both as geoeconomically and also geopolitically. Geopolitically, because we have mentioned about the ongoing challenges when it comes to the challenges of rule-based order and things of that sort. But geoeconomically, also infrastructure development, that is also another area which the three countries should be looking at in general for cooperation. And as far as whether the second question of RNA, that whether this should be looked at as a separate framework, or why can't we look at it in the existing multilateral frameworks? So as we mentioned at the outset of the report, this is sort of new, sort of framework that we're talking about. The India, Indonesia, Australia framework already exists. The problem is it has not taken off in a very substantial way. And there may be questions as to why, but that is the entire aim of this report, to show the potential and what more this trilateral cooperation can do. So this is already an existing mechanism. This is not a new mechanism that we are proposing. The three countries do already cooperate, as I mentioned, in existing forums like the IORA, the Pacific Island Forum, and places like that. But again, IORA is an organization which has so many countries with differing economic developments, with differing views. So currently, and I think if we look at how the IORA has worked also, it has only been when the three countries were chairs that we saw substantial progress taking place. So I think these three, as we've mentioned correctly, we are the anchors of the Indo-Pacific. So it gives opportunity for the three countries to probably strengthen the existing mechanisms of the region and also cooperate together as well. So yeah, that is my point.
Sure. Ben, any final comments?
Yeah, I think it's really important to look at this economic aspects. I think particularly from the perspective of President Jokowi, if this is to be the sort of idea he's going to be investing his political capital in, his time, his minister's time, he's going to want to know there is an economic element, because that's really always been the driving force of his presidency. And we know more generally that Australia is really keen to deepen economic ties with Indonesia. They just signed the trade deal. There's also been an economic strategy report written for India, and India is now writing one for Australia. I think India and Indonesia is probably the weak economic link, if you like, but there's certainly could be discussions there. I think the challenge is that Australia is obviously a very open trading economy. India and Indonesia are pretty protectionist and nationalistic in their economic orientation. So it may be difficult. What I would say is that I think there's value in the sort of geo-economic strategic conversations between these three countries in the broader sense, looking at the political risk related to investments, related to economies. And again, as three G20 economies, I imagine they're useful discussions that the finance ministers of all three countries could have about the state of the world economy and cooperation in the G20 and other forums. So I think there is value in pushing that forward. And I think it will be quite essential to get some movement there if you're to have the buy-in of President Jokowi in particular.
Thank you, Ben. Evan, any final comments?
Sure. Just quickly, I think Ben has already mentioned about the importance of the economic angle. So there is no way to have this trilateral framework as simply either a geopolitics framework alone or geoeconomics alone. I think it has to be both, as well as geostrategy, if you want to include the military element as well, which is why I think the framework that we developed in the report has these different elements, because we don't want to just focus on one aspect as if they're mutually exclusive with the other. My issue with the next step from the ASEAN outlook and whether or not the Indo-Pacific summit and all that will matter, is that from Indonesia's standpoint, what is the end goal and what is the strategic framework, I think is not particularly clear. As I said, a summit in itself is not a substitute for a strategy if we don't know what the outcome is that we're trying to achieve. Is the summit a prelude to something bigger? I think one can only hope. But I think the extension of the ASEAN outlook should be more than just figuring out what kind of infrastructure summit we can have. Although I think infrastructure is a key component of a potential trilateral framework. The question on why can't we just talk about these issues within existing multilateral forums rather than having a new one, I think is both an interesting and important question. One, I think existing multilateral forums already address some of these issues, maritime domain, economic development, political diplomacy and all that. The problem is always that multilateralism by nature increases the number of veto players. So the process tends to be prolonged and it has to take into account a wider set of actors, and it is not designed for rapid developments in the region. So my sense is that it would be a bad idea to incorporate some of what we're proposing into existing multilateral forums because they're not designed for it. So I think the key point of the framework is to figure out some of the practical stuff, some of the more closer to the interests of the three countries and how we can cooperate quicker and sooner rather than later. So by that design, I think the ideas that we propose can complement, for sure, existing multilateral forums. It's not designed to replace or supplant existing multilateral forums, but it cannot be incorporated within existing multilateral forums. So it is a separate set of proposals, but yes, they can complement existing forums. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. Unfortunately, I have to apologize that we ran out of time for the remaining questions, remaining unanswered questions. So I think we can wrap this up. I'll just say a few comments that one, for these three countries, we need more options. We need more possibilities. And from the bigger picture mindset, the trilateral cooperation is actually a strategic opportunity to elevate what already runs, not creating something entirely new. And this can complement existing multilateral forums, and it can also fill the gaps between, I think, what I've seen in the report that we've already talked about Indo-Pacific for a couple of years now. I think it's time to step it up and actually fill the rhetorics with more realities of Indo-Pacific. So with that, I'd like to close the session for today. Thank you for tuning in, for joining the event, both from Zoom and YouTube. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next webinar of CSIS. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.